Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Transcendiates and Swedenborgian community online. We are happy to connect with you today. And today we have a very special guest, actually a return guest for the online community folks, Ellie Schnarr. Greetings, Ellie.
Hello.
And
Thanks for having me on.
Oh, our pleasure. You know, we love having you on. Well, we'll get into it, how much amazing stuff you're up to. And my name, for those of you who don't know, I'm Cory, the Reverend of the online community and a volunteer host with the Swedenborg Foundation's Transcendiates. So be sure to subscribe because I think you'll enjoy this conversation, because we are going to be talking about Emanuel Swedenborg's, the 18th century mystic's, internal breathing. It's a pretty amazing topic, Ellie, that you've kind of dived into here lately.
Yeah, I think it started out with my fascination with the brain from a purely kind of neuroscientific perspective, and then I got into, of course, I was raised in the church, so I had some awareness that this stuff existed all my life, but I got really into Swedenborg's work on the brain and Swedenborg's ideas of embodied consciousness and kind of the anatomy of spirit, and that's really where I think, kind of following his story, that's where I think this idea of internal breathing originated, is in his idea of how the brain actually works, and then it just kind of blossomed and became this much more complicated kind of mythologized thing in the theological works. But I think it really starts with his exploration of the brain and embodied consciousness.
Could you tell us a little bit about the history of him engaging with the brain? And
yeah, so around 1738, Swedenborg left his job working as an assessor of mines for the King of Sweden. And he writes to the King of Sweden a letter saying, I really want to go south and spend some time just devoting myself to the study of anatomy. And probably the first place where he talks about the brain is in his work on tremulations, which he wrote when he was 30, which is one of the first things that he ever published, which is basically a kind of vibratory wave theory. And in that book, he says that the nervous system is kind of runs on tremulations as fast as lightning. Because of course he didn't have the concept of electricity.
It sounds like he was kind of right on for such a...
He was wrong about a lot,
yeah.
But he was also describing a lot of things in the language of his day, which we could describe in a much more specific way nowadays. So like there are certain words that he uses, like, you know, the word, the thing that he calls this energy within the nervous system, which we might call, you know, action potentials. He calls flucti spiritis, the spirit flow, or the breath flow, because spiro and respiratio come from the same Latin word. So if you think about, so his whole idea of how the brain works is very much dependent on his idea of how breath works. And this really shows up in his exploration of the pituitary gland, which is something that he's pretty well known for having the first really comprehensive idea of what the pituitary gland does. And he talks about how the sphenoid sinus, which is this sinus like way in the back and the top of your sinuses, has very subtle movements when you breathe. And so he says that this movement then had an effect on the pituitary gland, And the pituitary gland connects to the thalamus, and the thalamus has what are called thalamocortical fibers, which are the white matter tracts which move out from the thalamus into the cortex and determine the connectome field harmonics, or the way that the whole electrodynamic oscillatory structure of the energetic motion of the brain is determined. So he was pretty spot on. And one of the things I talk about in that video is this experiment that was done where they put electrodes in different places around the limbic system of volunteers who are actually epileptic patients who are having electrodes put in other parts of the brain to track epilepsy. And you can see that when you breathe through your nose, the whole limbic system, which is this whole kind of like central part of the brain, spikes. So it has a burst of energy when you breathe through your nose. So you look at all of these, worldwide breath control techniques and different forms of yoga and pranayama and stuff, and we can see how our direct embodied kind of neurological level of consciousness is being entrained and encoded through our breath. Yeah.
And I've heard it can calm your nervous system, and maybe I think that was in one of your presentations, right? And
yeah, so I kind of talk about because one of the ways that Swedenborg explains this internal breathing is that it's a motion in between the belly and the brain, and it's kind of this oscillation that goes like this. So I went to this one study that talks about breathing through the nose. This is kind of this breath up here. And then I went to another study that talks about the vagus nerve and how breath control techniques increase your vagal tone, which can radically improve your mental health, and a whole slew of other things.
Wow.
And
yeah, because I remember the study and you saying something about how it increases your contentment, your positivity, your sociability, and other things. Wow.
And all of that is like in the wiring in between the brain and the heart. And so there's this wonderful little essay that we kind of dove in.
Yeah, that's great. Let's keep diving.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So there's this wonderful little essay that he writes in. So there are two brain books, and I think I talked about this the last time I was on. But there's the first one, which is the Venice manuscript, which is this book, which is published by the Swedenborg Scientific Association. And this is kind of the more famous one, and it's the first one. And then so this one was 1738 to 1740. And then this one's like 4 or 5 years later. It's probably around 1745.
So is he in his 50s-ish?
Yeah, so this is like right as he's going into his spiritual awakening. And he very clearly in the dream diary says, I'm having all these spiritual experiences as I am studying the brain. And that's really important because as he's studying the brain, he's also studying breath control. And
doing it, right? Wow.
Right. And, I see that all coming from this other essay, which is in the second manuscript. And so this manuscript is Codex 55, and this is published as the brain. Oh, sorry, I picked up the wrong one.
No worries. Wait, and so that one's less well known. Interesting.
Yeah. So this one's less well known, and it's also published by the Swedenborg Scientific Association, but this one's a little bit fragmentary.
So you can order those online through the
Yeah.
Swedenborg Scientific
Yeah.
Association?
And the first one's called the cerebrum and the second one's called the brain. But the second one actually doesn't have the last chunk of this manuscript, which was published once, I discovered, in like 1830 and in English as part of the economy of the animal kingdom. But other than that, like it's you know, has barely seen the light of day. And that is this one, and this is the Latin. And so within this last chunk are kind of what I think some of the most brilliant and fascinating things that Swedenborg wrote. And it's all, it's a neuropathology text. And so he goes through, let me see, he goes through all sorts of different things. Let me see if I can pull up the...
So by neuropathology, what do you mean?
Different diseases of the brain. Morbus cerebri, I think is what he calls it. But
now, are these actually like mental diseases in a sense?
Yeah. So swooning, syncope, asphyxia, catalepsy, ecstasy.
So he's describing
orgasm.
He's describing what they look like in the brain, or what's he describing there?
He's describing what he thinks the neurocorrelates are, what kind of the outward manifestation of these diseases are, somnambulism, the incubus, insomnia, depression, fanatical imagination, loss of memory, alcoholism, stupidity.
What do you find fascinating about that area of the book?
I've gone through a lot of it, and there are a lot of places where he seems to be kind of spot on, in line with a lot of very contemporary thinking. The one that I really point to is he identifies he has a thing on mania, and he identifies the neurological cause of a manic episode as a certain inflammation, and I forget exactly what part of the brain, but within some of the connections between the medulla and the cortex. And this idea that mental health problems can be caused by inflammation is actually something that there's a lot of research to support. But the essay within all of these really caught my attention, is the one on ecstasy.
Let's hear it.
So let's see if I just had it open.
Because I'm assuming he's talking about breath control. Oh, actually, I remember from your presentation, he's talking about breath control.
Right. So one of the things that he says about halfway through, I suspect that an alternate cause of ecstasy is the inhibition or suffocation of the respiration of the lungs, while the pulsation of the heart and arteries and the movement of the cerebrum, cerebellum, medulla oblongata, and spinal cord survives. Wow. So this is where he starts talking about, like, what about this ecstatic near-death state. And there were other people at his time who were working, I forget exactly the name of the guy, but I have it written down somewhere, but there were other people at his time who were working on this question of how do you tell when someone's dead. And of course, during that time, there was this whole scare about people getting like locked in their coffins. And so they had like alarm coffins at the time. So this was a big deal in his day, was wow. How exactly do you determine the moment of death? And so I think he starts looking at this question of these ecstatic near-death states, because that's very much the type of ecstasy he's talking about. is like he describes someone getting thrown overboard on a ship and having the water pumped out of them, and then them describing this ecstatic near-death experience.
And there's like a movie about that kind of thing too, and we hear it from other folks.
Yeah, no, and it's something that, I mean, the work of Moody, of course, is something that Swedenborgians love. Yeah. And that's, you know, kind of continuing in the same conversation as questioning what this is. And one of the things that shows up in some modern research is this idea that when the heart stops, the brain produces endogenous dimethyltryptamine, which is a psychedelic compound.
Wow.
Yeah. And that has something to do with this reversal of the heart-brain axis. Yeah. And so I got interested in this topic of internal breathing when I was very young. I used to, and I have, this is in the video, the only way that I could stay up at night was if I was reading Swedenborg. And so my mom would let me, you know, I could get away with staying up for hours if I was reading the Word. And so the book of the Word, which I chose, being a good Swedenborgian, was a spiritual diary. And so it's just always been one of my favorite texts, and that's where he really gets into some of his edgier stuff and his like really deep descriptions of his own experiences.
Yeah, quite the set of texts. And for those who don't know, there's a line of Swedenborgians who believe Swedenborg's writings are scripture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I've been interested in this text forever, and I would lie in bed at night and try to do these breath control techniques that he was talking about. And so it's something that I've been doing all my life. And I you know, at the same time, this artwork that's behind you,
your art,
my artwork,
yeah,
that's behind you, all of those
famous Swedenborgians,
yeah,
from Helen Keller to D.T. Suzuki, right there,
to Carl Jung, Annie Besant's up there.
Yeah, thank you for those, by the way.
Yeah. But the inspiration behind those backgrounds was my own kind of introspective synesthesia. So this idea within Swedenborg that there is this flucti spiritis, this spiritual flow that exists on your internal levels of your awareness, is something that I've always been really interested in. And that's what those images are. They're attempts to kind of illustrate that gyrating flow of turning gyres, which is just the most beautiful description of a fractal.
That's pretty wondrous, and the
Right.
art is really wondrous. So thank you for all the work that you're doing. I mean, look at it.
I'm trying to keep myself busy.
So you were drawn into this idea when you were a kid, sort of like Swedenborg, because doesn't he say that he had some breathing techniques even when he was a little kid?
Right. And so he talks about doing this from the time that he was very young, and that this was how he concentrated. And so his initial kind of drive was not, I want to talk spirits. His initial drive was really, I want to figure out problems. And so the soul and like the embodiment of consciousness for him becomes like an engineering problem. And I kind of really respect that way of thinking about it. And I think like, even though he becomes super theological, it never really goes away, because it's always these like kind of mechanistic, you know, the the layers of heaven kind of fit together like gears. And so, you know, I think there's a really natural, beautiful harmony between his way of thinking and the chakra system.
Yeah.
That because he describes these you know, gyrating forms of turning gyres, and places them within parts of the body very specifically. And there's he copies it into a couple of places, but there's this beautiful spiritual experience that he has that I didn't include in the video, but I thought would be nice to kind of bring up, because he describes 4 points of action in the heavenly body that are the places where influx flows from the heavenly realm into the physical realm. And this is Arcana Celestia 3884. So he goes from the left temple, which he identifies as the organs of reason. So the left side of the brain is reason and the right side of the brain is will.
Sounds very modern thinking.
It's pretty accurate. And I think, because there's a lot of like the left brain, right brain discourse that I don't like so much. But I actually really love Swedenborg's description, because he goes back and forth. But so at the beginning it switches, and then he's kind of like unsure. But then by the time he gets to the Arcana, which is 1750-ish, he's pretty set that the left side of the brain is reason. You know, the understanding of truth, and the right side of the brain is will, or the will to good.
And then that involves love, right?
Yeah. So this love and truth dichotomy becomes like a hemispheric dichotomy. And he also, you know, one of the like really beautiful moments in his work on the brain, one of the first places that I can find him using the word conjugial rather than conjugal, but one of the first places that I can
talking about love.
Yeah, so talking about, but specifically like this sexual marriage love, that's also like a cosmic principle, and you know, that word wasn't a word that's regularly used. It actually seems like he was a classicist. And it seems like he got it from Ovid's Ars Amatoria. I might be saying that wrong.
Because he wasn't using, as you said, he wasn't using the word we normally associate, like conjugal.
Yeah.
At least in English.
That I is in there, and he very specifically puts that I in there. And it's so one of the only people who uses that word extensively is Ovid, and he uses it in a work called Ars Amatoria. And this is this explicitly sexual book about, you know, the art of love, the Ars Amatoria. And so that sexual connotation seems to be something that he's pulling through from Ovid. But one of the first places that he uses the word conjugialis is in his description of the way that the hemispheres interact. So, and it's kind of vague, because I've looked at this passage a couple of times, and it's kind of vague to see whether he is talking about left brain, right brain, or whether he's talking about cerebrum, cerebellum. Because he talks about both relationships, but I think they're really two different manifestations of duality, and he could be describing either one.
And they kind of mirror the structure of heaven, according to him, both cerebrum, cerebellum, and
this is, you know, one of the quotes that I think I had in there, is he says that the heavenly form in its most intimate sphere was the form of the churning circumvolutions that are visible in human brains. And so there's something like really beautiful about that idea, that just as the brain is the seat of our individual embodied consciousness. The brain is the seat of the most intimate conjugal relationship within the grand human of heaven. And so that duality becomes this beautiful kind of fractal that comes out and out and out into the world, and is manifested in our consciousness as it is. And it's just
sounds like something. Well, please.
No, go on.
Yeah, it sounds like something that I hear about a lot in culture today, about kind of the universe being a hologram, and this like over consciousness and the microcosm, the macrocosm fitting together.
And I think that's something that, you know, shows up in traditions all over the world, because it's true. There's also ideas of like quantum physics and consciousness, which I'm not sure I know enough about to really talk about. But this idea that you can see consciousness as a waveform which collapses at the point of observation. And so when you're looking at the brain itself, so you can kind of see the body as a continuum from, you know, the natural, the most external physical sensory plane, which is out here. And then as that information moves inward, closer and closer to your brain, and we could also talk about it moving up through the chakras, going from, you know, this state down here up through a heart and lungs consciousness, into a vocal consciousness, into, you know, consciousness of consciousness within the brain in itself. You can think about it like each of these points along your body shortens the feedback loop. And so eventually when you get to the point where your focus is within the brain itself, you can gain consciousness of consciousness, and you can observe the observer in a way that kind of short circuits the whole system. And that's, you know, that moment of awakening. So we look at someone like Swedenborg, and he's performing breath control techniques. He's studying the brain, and he's, you know, increasingly, you know, through this intense focus, bringing his awareness from this external breath up and up and up through the brain itself. And I digress, because I was going through these 4 points that he talks about in the Arcana, and I really wanted to get through that list. So the first one is the point at the left temple, the seat of reason. And then the second one, it moves to the respiration of the lungs, which controls speech. And this is something that he talks about over and over again. It's really central to this whole idea of internal breathing, that he says people in the most ancient church, or people like the people in the most ancient church, which is really important, because you can like easily debate the historicity of this. Right. So he has this concept of the churches, and that, you know, basically all of humanity is developing together into higher and higher states of consciousness. And that, you know, it goes from most ancient to ancient, to Israelitish, to Christian to new.
Although, right, when he talks about the most ancient and the ancient, he often talks about them in kind of higher terms, because they had like early humans had a deep connection with divinity as far as he was concerned. Right.
So he's very, you know, I call myself a pagan Borgian, but it's really going back to this idea of the ancient church and the most ancient church as something which had, you know, incredible highs, but then also, you know, really fell. And you get, you know, human sacrifice cults, and, you know, and all of this awful stuff which he was aware of. But, you know, it's an awareness that, you know, you don't have to go back to all of the evil that you came out of. And I think this really applies to, like, you know, the conversation we're having right now about white supremacy, and about you know, a lot of our racial issues, I think are all tied up in this. That when you go back into what your ancestors have done, you can acknowledge that they fucked up. You can acknowledge that you know, that there's a lot of horror and a lot of pain in your background, but you know, they have fallen states and they have enlightened states. And so right now, I think we're dealing with the fallout from the fall of the Christian church, which, you know, this is kind of another kind of pet thing of mine, but I think, you know, it's important to say it in this moment, that Swedenborg acknowledges, he's talking about spirits in a hellish state who are in an extremely externalized state where they have no awareness of what's going on in their internal selves. And these spirits in this externalized state, he says, the only thing that I can think of to possibly like compare to the hell that they're in is the Spaniards going after the heathen women and children with dogs and beasts. So he directly compares an externalization of our spiritual lives to colonialism.
That's really poignant.
Yeah, and so it's like, oh, right now we're dealing with the fallout of the fall of the Christian church, and it shows up, you know, in the hell of a society that we built for ourselves.
Yeah, to him, it's the hell isn't that people aren't Christian, right? It's that no matter what our religion, we can embody hell.
Yeah.
And be oriented towards colonialism or domination,
or
what have
you know, and this externalization, however that looks. And the epitome of that state for him was, you know, conquistadors sending dogs after Native women and children in Mexico. So he was aware of that. And I think that's really, really important to keep in mind.
Well, yeah, today I think, yeah, you're right on. It's interesting that he would call it out in that way, because, you know, we don't hear a lot of folks in Europe calling out colonialism, as far as I can tell.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But
in that time,
it's an interesting number. And I don't have it written down right now, but it's if you type Spaniards into a search of the spiritual diary, you'll find it.
Yeah, so did you get through the 4 points?
No, I didn't. So there's the point in the left temple. There's the breathing of the lungs, which he said is controlled by spirits, by Respiro, and Spiro has this relationship again. And then the heartbeat. And then the kidneys. So you can see it kind of, this energy moving down. And one of the things that he says is that spirits in the most ancient church, how he identifies the fall of the most ancient churches, that their breathing patterns started out up here, and then they drop and they drop and they drop and they drop, and they get to a point where they're breathing from a point that's so low down, so it's like such a root chakra breath that they suffocate themselves.
So it's like the description of becoming more, root chakra based, and maybe like lustful and dominating. And external. Yeah. That hellishness that you talked about, being just oriented towards the external world and not giving credit to people's emotions and spiritual life. And
that's faith alone. And
like
which
faith alone saves.
Is the only, is one of the things that he most strongly identifies with the fall of the Christian church, is that y'all got so obsessed with being right that you forgot how to be kind. You were like, oh, we have to go save the heathens We have to go, sail across the ocean, with a cross to convert all of these people, and it doesn't matter that we're killing off 95% of the Native Americans, and it doesn't matter that, we're completely devaluing human life. It doesn't matter that, all of this horror is happening because we forgot how to be kind. And so that's the hell that we're up against in this moment. And so, I've kind of made it my own thing to be, if we have this method that he talks about of opening up your internal states through an increasingly deep awareness of your interoception of your own body, then we should be using it. Because I think, this state of externalization is it's not doable. It's not sustainable. And we're seeing right now, very clear evidence that it's not sustainable environmentally, it's not sustainable socially. And the only way, as individuals that we spiritually survive that is by going back into our internal states. And so I think that there's a lot of, perfectly valid, very Marxist critique about spirituality being something that ultimately, this idea of becoming a transcendent, you transcend so much that you lose touch with reality. You kind of suck yourself up into some other dimension up here, and you don't have to worry about all the suffering.
That's just called an idiot.
Yeah. And so what I'm seeing in this very clear description of this breath that's happening within the nervous system, this subtle breath, this heavenly breath, I'm seeing something that goes all the way from a divine state and then comes all the way down to manifests itself in the reality of embodied consciousness. And so to me, that's the second coming of Christ. Is how do you embody love and wisdom in your actual experience, all the way to the dendrite, to the individual ion flowing along an axon, and see that coursing spiritual energy that is the basis of your consciousness is something which manifests in the world, through the world. And so you have to make the world a better manger for Christ to be born. Yeah. And
that's beautiful, and I think well put.
But
we have to receive divinity in our lives. And I mean, what else really matters to us individually? The second coming of Christ could be, God flying in on a cloud hoverboard. But if it's not incarnating in your spirit and your soul, what does it matter to at least you specifically? And
right.
I think you're right. Yeah.
And I think that's really, what makes something the word, is does it reflect in you? And this is this idea of what we used to call the one man principle, or the one human principle. And that's this idea that when you look at a sacred text, how you tell whether it's sacred is whether or not it can relate to anyone, is whether or not it can contain a universal metaphor for internal spiritual development. And that doesn't mean that, and Swedenborg goes to the Bible because that's his culture. And the Bible then becomes the most precious and perfect thing because it's the thing that he spends the most time with. But I think you could do it with the Poetic Edda, you could do it with the Devi Gita, you could do it with the Quran. And it's really the question that I think that I always ask myself when I approach a sacred text, is how am I applying this to my own spiritual life, and how is this teaching me specifically how to grow exactly where I am, and that's what makes it sacred.
That's
Yeah.
awesome. Yeah, and that there are many ways to connect with divinity, and sometimes that scripture or that inspiration in our lives is just our experience and striving to listen to God.
The thing that you know I've been focusing on so much is how, because Swedenborg says that people in the most ancient church had the word written on their hearts. You've heard this phrase? And that's something that really stuck with me, because, you know, you can think of it of like writing on a heart, or you can think of it like, no, there's something about the motion of the heart. There's something about the experience of having a heartbeat that reminds us of God. There's something about the experience, the way that breath affects our body, that can teach us something. There's something about, you know, when we sit in interoception, when we sit in meditation, and you go deeper and deeper along your own, you know, neurologically moderated anatomical like field of awareness, you get closer and closer to, you know, some essential realization. And so, you know, I think there's loads of traditions that do this, and specifically tantra is something that I really love, and Kriya Yoga I think is a really beautiful.
I want to ask you more about the breath and
Yeah.
where Swedenborg was going with that, because I think you beautifully connect it to things like tantra and yoga, and how Swedenborg was kind of keying into these practices that have often been uplifted as real tools, real, you know, human tools for human, you know, transcendence, like to become a transcendent, to rise above the id. And yet Swedenborg doesn't always write, like he doesn't always write, or not even often write, about being practical about spirituality in that way. This is something you found in his diary. So I'm curious how that kind of ties into what you're saying.
Right, because his practicality, well, there's a couple different ways that you can approach this. First of all, he didn't have any awareness of yoga traditions that we know about. You know, he was aware that there were heathens in Asia. That's as far as he goes. And you know, in this beautiful quote where he says, you know, the population of Europe is approximately 10% of the world, and this is the only place where Christianity is the norm. So how could you possibly think that only Christians go to heaven? And you know, what about the heathens in Asia and America? And so that's about the limit of his awareness, that yoga was even a thing. So the place where I do see it coming from actually is traditions of far north shamanism, and so Linnaeus, the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species guy, was actually a good friend of Swedenborg's. And he, at the same time that Swedenborg went south to Venice to study the brain, Linnaeus went north to Lapland to study plants. But he also ended up writing a lot about the tribes that lived up there, the indigenous people that lived up there, who were like the Sami and other groups. And one of the things that he brings back with him is this description, which I found a while ago, and I've been trying to track down because none of these texts are easily searchable, but there's a description that Swedenborg has of this experience of an internal kind of photistic light. And in this essay on ecstasy, he talks about the Sami and the Lapland, the shamans of Lapland, going into ecstatic trance states while playing drums. And so he has this awareness of ancient indigenous European cultures that are pre-Christian. So, and then, you know, if you take the kind of shamanic perspective seriously, if you're using breath to go into trance states, to talk to spirits on a spirit plane, you know, who are you talking to? And all around the world, you know, who are you contacting? And there's, you know, I personally, I think he's talking to his own ancestors. So I think that if there's a root for what he's doing, the root is in indigenous European traditions, but it's also, he's strongly influenced by Kabbalah. So yeah. There's all of this stuff that goes into Swedenborg, and Swedenborg then reinterprets and appropriates it in his own way, but he develops this incredibly sophisticated kind of interoceptive meditation technique and meditation practice out of looking at the brain and looking at breath as a universalizing human experience. And I think I veered far off of your original question.
I think, but you hit on some really great stuff there.
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't often talk much about the indigenous cultures in Europe and how they were still around in many places, and their traditions are somewhat around now, and that there's an interaction to some degree between the different cultures. It's amazing to hear. And it's funny that you mentioned a drum and you've been mentioning heartbeat, because there's been a kind of a heartbeat noise. I don't know if it's your desk or what it is, but it's like a very round noise, and it kind of fits perfectly. So maybe we'll all end up in a trance by the end of it.
Hopefully.
That's awesome.
That's the idea. But
no, it's actually beautiful. And so, yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah, it's completely fascinating. And just the idea that, you know, you can go, like, you take a Hindu Swami's brain and you take, you know, my brain or whatever, you can't really, the nervous system works the same anywhere. So when you start your spirituality from the point of the body, you really do get this kind of universalizing perspective that at the same time it's not trying to blend everything together. It's saying that our embodiment is what gives us empathy, is what allows us to, you know, to communicate across cultural experience. And I think that's a really powerful idea. And, you know, because I think that textual exegesis is very important, and I'm glad that people do it. And I think that there's a strong place for it, but I see my own kind of project as one of anatomical exegesis, of looking at the brain and the human body in general, but my own body as a text, through which we can realize divine consciousness, and as, you know, a vehicle to take us to higher and deeper states of awareness, which I think Swedenborg was a master at, and I think it's our birthright to do the same thing.
Amen.
Amen.
Yeah. I think there's a reason why in the West we're being pulled towards some of these Eastern traditions that maintain that. And I think what we often miss is the spiritual lens. I mean, we'll get some of it from our yoga teacher sometimes, but to really, like, I think not identifying, but engaging with it on each level allows for its true power, because, you know, you're talking about exegesis from the body, and that, it sounds like you mean engaging with it, like, spiritually, mentally, through practice, breathing practice and reflection, and how wonderful.
Yeah, it's a gift. I mean, and it's so exciting that, being able to approach this and then approach all of these sacred traditions as sacred and as something that's just, it's right here, and so I've always been a little bit suspicious of this concept of the other world. Like, we think of it as like, there's this natural plane and then there's this spiritual plane, and we're not meant to be aware of like how they contact each other. But I think Swedenborg kind of goes back and forth on like how exactly this works, and the principle of correspondences is the place where they connect, and that's these 4 points that he talks about: the brain, the heart, the lungs, and the kidneys. And when you actively put that in your body, with like your full somatic awareness, it's completely different than thinking about it kind of. It's just it's complete. It's not intellectual. It's embodied and deeply alive, and that's the divine human, because Jesus Christ had to have a body. Jesus Christ had to have all of these organs and all of these structures, and aligning your own embodied consciousness to this divine grand human through these points allows that flow to work. And one of the quotes that I have in the video is he talks about the discrete gyres showing up at these points, and then how through meditation they all connect.
Oh wow.
And it goes from separate kind of places of energy, and then they all flow together. And so it's it aligns with this natural spiritual celestial, or natural spiritual celestial. I think you can do it either way. But there's a point where from the spiritual state of consciousness, they all flow as one. And they're discrete degrees, but it's the motion between the degrees that creates reality. And,
which really ties into a lot of what folks say about chakras and the energies, as you're pointing out.
Yeah. And I think that's because, they're both observing something that's real. And these are two different systems, which should be approached in their own right. And I think that we can appreciate both of them without, appropriating too much. But you look at, and you have two different people without any contact on opposite ends of the world, and they're talking about the same thing. Well, maybe there's some deeper truth that's in between both of them. And it's that deeper embodied experience that's not really something that can be explained with words, that I'm really interested in.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah. So real embodiment and empowerment.
Yeah, and I think that idea of living praxis is something that the church desperately needs.
Yeah, because ultimately, I mean, if we're going to live into these things internally to the external, to how we behave in society, doesn't that mean fighting for justice and being willing to be that meditative, actionable presence?
Right.
In situations like what we see today.
And that we don't have faith if we don't have charity. Mm-hmm. We don't have love if we don't have truth. And constantly remembering that faith alone is the fall of the Christian church, and faith alone is the thing that got us wherever the hell we are today, as far as our whole kind of social state and our social problems. I really think faith alone is deeply embedded in all of them, and the only way out of faith alone is through charity and empathy and love for the neighbor, and a deep acknowledgement that, you know, even though we have vast, you know, and possibly irreparable cultural divides, we are all experiencing a divine field of consciousness within our embodied lives. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a deeply healing truth for me. And I don't, yeah.
Oh, beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, if nothing else, faith alone condemns everyone who's not in your church to hell.
Yeah.
And I know some people will hold pretty hard and fast to that idea.
Yeah.
But I think you're right, that lack of the care and charity and love.
And empathy.
Yeah, it doesn't really allow for the heaven within to bloom, let alone without.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And so, you know, where the idea of internal breathing goes as you look at Swedenborg's lifetime, because it starts out as this very anatomical idea that this is something that has to do with, you know, the oscillatory vibratory motion of the brain. And then, you know, very, you know, gradually over, you know, 20 years of writing, it becomes it becomes the oscillatory patterns between divine love and wisdom within the grand human and God himself, God themselves, God herself. And so it becomes more and more abstracted, but even in TCR, even at the very end of his life, Swedenborg is still talking about the anatomy. He's still constantly bringing it back to the anatomy, and constantly, you know, if we don't make something useful, if we don't make something, you know, functional for human beings as they are, then, you know, you're not doing anything. You're screwing around, because it has to come down into praxis, whether it's internal praxis or external praxis. And I'm a firm believer that you need both, because if you're just sitting there, you know, doing yoga in a cave, it's, you know, it's nice, and
sometimes there's a time for that.
Yeah, there's a time for that.
Yeah.
But I think the point of those kind of internal explorations is to then turn around and teach someone else. It's to turn around and help your community, feed someone, plant a garden, and, you know, that's what makes it complete. But the more we can open ourselves up to our internal states, the more satisfaction and the more of an experience of this heavenly bliss we're going to have when we actually go out and perform our uses. And that seems to be like the place where he gets to in these like high theological works like Divine Love and Wisdom, is this idea that that it has to manifest in how we actually treat each other. And that's the second coming of Christ. But it's coming all the way from the neurological correlates, and from the kind of quantum vibratory, more like scientific end of stuff. It's coming all the way from that, and then all the way out and manifesting in our actual social experience.
Amazing. And I think you've gotten that point across, that the breathing can help. So if I wanted to kind of employ some of what you've learned in terms of breathing, what would you say?
I think that one of the most helpful places that I've found him talking about is the part in, let me just see it, the kind of 4 steps that show up in the spiritual diary number 3464.
Yeah, that's the one I wrote down.
Yeah. No, that's the really good one.
Your notes on that are great. Yeah.
He talks about this 4-step process by which, you know, pre-Adamite spirits, which I love. So these spirits in a state of just extreme innocence, you know, neonatal spirits, So that kind of state is the state where you have to really get yourself to, is the state of the very first memory, which is also something in transcendental meditation.
Wow.
Right.
Like what Jesus said about you have to become like a child to enter the kingdom of heaven.
Exactly. So these spirits are from this very, very innocent state, are introduced from external breathing into internal breathing. And he says it goes by 4 steps. And the first step is the type of breathing that I use right now, the type of breathing that you use when you talk, which is a very externalized form of breath. And then slowly that breath gets minimized, gets lessened, and you become aware that there's also a breath that's happening through the nervous system, that there's this pulsation of energy. And
am I right in thinking that, like, when you're kind of calming your breathing, you try to breathe out for longer, like through your nose?
And that's how they say that you activate the vagus nerve. And it's in through the nose, which entrains your limbic system, and then out through the mouth, and that long exhalation that's going up from the belly actually strengthens your vagal tone.
Oh yeah, is it out through the mouth? Oh, I didn't know that.
Well, there's lots of different systems, and Swedenborg doesn't specifically talk about it, but one of the things that he does talk about is this idea that you have kind of a long waveform that's the respiration of the lungs. That's the normal breathing. That's the slowest thing. And then there's the heartbeat. And so there's kind of a fast waveform of the heartbeat and a slow waveform of the lungs. And then in the brain, he talks about how the motion of the lungs entrains the spiritus flux, the electrodynamic oscillations of the cerebrum itself, of the actual nerve fibers. But then the heartbeat controls how the actual blood vessels spread out. And so he talks about the space between the nerve fibers and the heartbeat as having this other waveform.
Wow.
So, and it's actually a lot like the Schrodinger equation, if that's a total thing, but you can think about it along these kind of oscillatory mathematical ways, where you have the quick heartbeat and you have the slow motion of the lungs, and then there's a third like interference pattern that shows up in between these two wavelengths. And he talks about this breath of the brain being quicker than the breath of the lungs. And I found that, and I don't know, I can feel it when I'm in a deep state of meditation. And and so it was so exciting to me to start looking at Kriya Yoga, because it's saying it's like exactly the same thing. And so for me, it was kind of like, oh, you can feel this. And lots of people throughout history have said, you can feel this, you can learn to be aware of the electrodynamic motion of energy through the brain. And so I think that he sets up these 4 steps where you go from the external breath to the subtle breath, and then the external breath drops away. And he said he would spend an hour without breathing. And as the external breath drops away, that motion of the nervous system becomes dominant. And that's that ecstatic state. And as you go into that ecstatic state, eventually you become aware of an even subtler level of breathing. That's the angelic breath. And the angelic breath is like almost almost unfeelable. But the fact that, you know, we see people having these ecstatic experiences shows us that it's actually relatively easy to train yourself to move from the external respiration into a respiration that's based around the electrodynamics of the nervous system.
We should note that it probably does take some training, and you want to be safe about it.
Yeah. And it's like, if you just try to hold your breath until you pass out,
don't force it, please.
That's not the point. That's not what you're doing. And it takes years, but the fact of the matter is, lots of people do this. You know, it's not impossible. And one of the things he says is that he would, when he's in these deep trance states, he would only breathe enough to think. So it's moving enough air. It's not holding your breath. It's kind of stopping your own control of your breath. It's allowing heaven to breathe for you, is how he describes it. That you get into a state where you're no longer initiating every breath, where you actually feel this spiritual influx that moves through the brain and actually gives you just enough oxygen to stay in a cognitive state. And then, of course, you know, after years and years of practice, Swedenborg was able to, you know, go deeper and deeper and deeper into this kind of near-death state and have all of these experiences. And, you know, I'm not really interested in teaching people to talk to dead people. Like that's not the interesting part here. I'm really interested in teaching people to get into deeper levels of their own internal awareness.
Yeah.
And how to use that.
Amazing.
To, you know, be happy.
Yeah.
Experience cosmic transcendent bliss. Why not?
Yeah, uplift heavenliness. Whether or not you think there's a heaven, we can clearly experience hell on earth. So.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think heaven is also just as accessible if you're in the right state of mind.
Can I ask one more question about meditation, just because I'm kind of geeking out, and then we'll probably close here soon.
Sure.
Thanks so much. This has been amazing.
Yeah. No, this is a lot of fun.
Oh, cool. When you are entering your meditative journeys or meditations, or when Swedenborg was, what do you often do with your thinking? How do you focus that, or how do you enter a meditative space for those working on that?
So I have really bad OCD. I have all my life. Like, I've never been able to just like clamp down and like control my thinking and just like get my brain to just stop. It's tough. But so the thing that I have to do, because I have a lot of trouble just like dropping straight into it. The thing that I have to do is really to increase my awareness of something that's happening synesthetically, and then get myself to be excited about it. And so if I can learn to follow a single internal sensation, then as you take that, like as you take that concentrated kind of ball of awareness and you move it upwards, it naturally moves into deeper and deeper levels of interoceptive awareness. And so for me, the anatomy part of meditation became really important, because, you know, the brain then becomes, or the whole body then becomes a tool. And a tool which, if you kind of transcend through these spiritist gyres in the right way, you know, you'll get yourself into a meditative state that you're excited about. You get, and you're like, oh, wow, this is incredible. You know, I wouldn't want to be focusing on anything else, because I'm so excited to be focused on this internal light. And so
amazing.
Yeah, and I think that's the only way that I'm able to kind of drop into that samadhi state, is if I have some kind of a ritual, and some kind of a path to follow, and I think that's why these systems exist.
Well, perfect. I think I'll find that really helpful. I'm sure our listeners will as well. This has been such a gift, Ellie. If people want to learn more, where do they go? And you mentioned the video.
So I have several videos on my YouTube channel, and you can tune into those. And if you want to ask questions in those, I'm happy to help. I also have I'm very open and available on Facebook and Instagram, where I'm Eleanor Schnarr on Instagram. And if anyone's interested in kind of supporting my research in a more concrete way, I also have a Patreon that's Eleanor Schnarr at Patreon.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Oh, perfect. And if they want to find your video, I'm sure it's under Swedenborg Internal Breathing.
Yeah, it's called Animate Flux, an introduction to Swedenborg's internal breathing, and it's on my YouTube channel, which is under Eleanor Schnarr.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, and we can link that in the description.
Yeah, for sure. It'll be right at the top, folks, so please check that out. And yeah, again, this has been wonderful. I've been amazed, really.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Well, our pleasure, and we want to have you on again soon. So let's keep in connection, and
of course, anytime.
Yeah. Well, you've been a great friend, and you and Tom and all those folks in Berkeley. Say hi to everyone for me.
I will. Oh, hi from Berkeley, and you're still in Canada, right?
Yep, still in Ontario, with the Church of the Good Shepherd in the online community.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's great. The Swedenborgian community, for those who don't know, is a wonderful one. I'm always amazed by the heart, the insight, the wisdom, truly, and so please subscribe if you're watching this and feel inspired. And yeah, let's say, as a goal, before our next connection on the online community, we each take some time to work on some breathing, reflecting on Ellie's words of deep insight, and maybe share what the experience has been like for us. So
thank you so
again.
much. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Bye, folks.
See you soon.